Before we start and provide your perspectives around service operations and the responses we are seeing across a diverse set of clients, I want to make sure we re-emphasize how we first and foremost feel COVID is a humanitarian challenge. How many of us are personally getting affected? We see our loved ones getting affected. Our thoughts are with everyone who's going through this crisis. We hope that we come out of it stronger. So on that note, let's move on to the next slide. So I think before we launch into how we collectively as service operations leadership see the impact, it is very important to calibrate on what is service ops and how predominant it is in our everyday life. There's some examples and factoids that you see on your slide right now. I'll rattle off a few, and these are obviously you are very intimate and familiar with. But things like, there's already 21 days of lockdown. India, which has shut down every service that India provides, including all the call centers we all rely on. If you think about the airport traffic in US, massive decline in the last 1 month, literally almost to the tune of 50%. You've seen 81% increase in the e-commerce volumes in Italy just in 1 month, which speaks volumes of how the digital channels are becoming much more pronounced now. We have seen 200 million people displaced in China and working from home. This is not too dissimilar from what we are seeing in geographies which are in Europe, North America, Latin, etc. Right? And last of all is the stat right in the middle, which always amazes me around how predominant service operations is in our day-to-day life, whether it's field service operations, customer care, back office operations, support functions, etc., etc. Almost 80% of the workforce in US is engaged in services. And hence the implications on service operations and what we see our clients starting to do and activate becomes overly critical. So on that note, let's move to the next slide, Christian. So we as McKinsey have started thinking about it across 5 different phases of how we will grow from the current crisis to the next norm. And the word next is very important here because that next normal will be very different from the normal that we have always been experiencing. And a lot of our senior experts think this is the most disruptive change our generations and several generations before us have seen. There's a white paper that our managing director, Kevin Sneeder, published, which outlines these 5 phases. Look, the most important thing is we are already seeing institutions and leaders starting to articulate their thinking after the first 2 to 3 weeks of frenzy, the things were falling apart, and people were trying to resolve things on what is the most near-term impact on their virtualization of workforce, demand falling through the cliff, significant shifts and stresses in the capital market, right? So we were seeing a lot of first few weeks going into resolve. We're slowly starting to now see more action happening on resilience, which is some strategic choices, which are not easy, and they affect their customers, their advisors, their employees, their strategies, and the resilience is now starting to kick in. Right? Today, we'll focus a lot about resilience and what we are seeing across different dimensions of resilience when it comes to service operations. We anticipate seeing what's happening now in Southeast Asia, the return. There's optimism that the return will happen. The phases will take different times. We are very confident from what we're seeing as patterns of rebound that the return to business as usual will happen. But the most important thing is the next 2 phases, reimagination and reform. Now, reimagination is something about reinventing. It is not about small changes. It is not about introducing pandemic crisis management in a much more robust manner. It is about reimagining your strategy, your operating model, your go-to customers, your channel mix, your employee engagement. And that reimagination, the process of that reimagination is already being activated across several institutions with a view that that'll kick in several months following from this crisis. And last one is reform, which is we anticipate that the industry, we will see 2021 onwards will be dramatically different from what we have been used for last several years. So in all our discussions, in today's webinar, in subsequent webinars, we'll go back to these phases of resolving right now, resilience, returning to normalcy, reimagining future, which is very different, and finally reforming in a way which is the next generations will not know that the businesses were conducted the way we were always used to. Thank you, Kristen. So let's move on to the next one. In-service operations within McKinsey, here are the dimensions we think about when we think about what will change across different aspects. The first and foremost one I want to emphasize is, given 80% of the services workforce is in services, the massive amount of displacement and disruption that is happening, employee safety, support, motivation will be paramount. I think this is the first and foremost frontiers we see several of our clients thinking about. The next one, and equally critical, is customer engagement. In some industries, it is about advisor, broker, etc. engagement too. This will fundamentally change. Customers are in the moment of stress right now, the ways of engaging, the channels that they will use, the needs that they will need to be addressed will be dramatically different. So is the combination of your employees serving customers in a different way, will it come through? It will be a primary question. The third one is demand and supply management. Look, I serve financial services. A lot of my panelists, co-panelists serve a variety of other sectors. We are seeing a significant shift in demand. Some of the demand is shrinking at an alarming rate. In other sectors, demand is not shrinking, but the nature of demand is changing. Related to that is supply changes. Supply chains, we all know, are getting affected. Some of the big operations like call centers are getting affected. The workforce skills to be able to handle more of advice that the clients need right now, the problem resolution that they need right now, there's a massive upskilling needed to get to that. Leadership and management systems. Look, this is about, are you setting in new APIs, new ceremonies, new visual management, new day-to-day coaching, new longer-term, top-down and bottom-up interaction of leadership with frontline, which is displaced now. How's the leadership and management systems going to work in the future? And finally, at the bottom, you see this is enablement through the next-gen operations. This is the practice I lead for McKinsey. This is the practice that has been helping clients transform a lot of these vectors already. But it's a combination of 5 different capabilities brought together. It's about digitization. It's about lean processes. It's about automation. It's about advanced analytics. And finally, it is also about business process outsourcing and offshore. So on that note, in the rest of our webinar and subsequent ones, we'll talk about the 5 phases that I mentioned earlier. And we talk about these vectors around employee safety, customer engagement, demand and supply management on an ongoing basis across these different phases. So on that note, I'll pass it on to Matthias to take us through the next phase of this presentation.
Yes,
I want to focus on these 3 dimensions: the employee safety and support, the customer engagement, and the demand and supply management. I'm based in Berlin, so not too far away from the epicenter of the crisis currently, which is here in Italy. And there's kind of 2 tales on the employee safety and support. You might have heard the stories from hospitals in Italy where they can't protect the doctors any longer, which is obviously the far extreme of how unsafe it is for employees, and still see the dedication of people showing up at work. On the other hand, I was in a session with the CEO of Bayer, who among other things also produce chloroquine and very crucial, important medical equipment, who basically have ramped up 3 shifts in all their factories and all their service operations to make sure that things continue to be delivered into the world. And they have come up with ideas of how to massively increase safety among their employees by keeping distances, by checking them in and out, making sure that the best for the employee safety, but also contributing massively to the world safety and health. And the question, I think, is where are you on this place, and how can you actually make sure to enable employees for new ways of working? I've seen organizations that move very swiftly into setting 100% of remote working in place, where people report better levels of productivity because they don't have to travel any longer. I also have experienced organizations where the technology has not been the problem, but the employees did not know what to work on and where the priorities were. to some cases where organizations were only prepared to support like 5 or 10% of their workforce in remote working, and they either had to stop working or they still have people working in unsecure places. So very different starting points, but I think very similar mechanisms that people are now taking to bring people, keep people working, or to bring them back into work. And we'll deep dive on this in terms of the kind of what to do on the resilience frontier. On the customer engagement, again, if we can take lessons from China, we now see that e-commerce has massively spiked. And what we've also seen, it has gone up by 20%. And even now, when kind of offline shopping is possible again, it only goes down by 3 to 4%. So there has been a disruptive shift. And how can you make sure both that the disruptive shift can actually be accommodated, how to increase channel capacity on the one hand side, but also how to make sure that customers are being informed of which channel to use. I'm working with an insurance client where people were not able to get through any longer on their call center capacity, so we're quickly introducing elements like chatbots and others to make sure that that customers actually can still reach the provider. And then on the demand and supply management, how to make sure that that there is a visibility into the bottlenecks in the system. So, and it could be in the incoming customer requests, but it could also in getting requests analyzed and getting cases cleared to finally kind of in an insurer case getting the payments out, and how to make sure that the demand and the supply is understood, not only on a day-to-day basis, but also with an outlook over the next 1 to 3 weeks at least, to be able to plan for what's around the next curve. In order to get a bit of a sense of where you all stand, we would like to actually ask you, and if we move to the next page, I have the 3 themes again, and get you into the polling, which comes now up on your screen. You should see it, the 3 different challenges that I've just laid out, or maybe it's all of the above. So if you could click on one of these A to D and then submit, so we get a bit of an impression of where you all stand, that would be very helpful. Most of you say that all of the above are real challenges. So we have 30%, and then we have 26% the employee safety, and then comes demand and supply, and then the customer engagement, which is indeed the typical heat curve that we see on the one hand side. So kind of there's so many problems that come up at the same time, and this is no longer linear management of tackling things one after the other, but really the things are happening all in parallel. And of course, the concern for making sure that our people are still safe is obviously the first and very immediate step. And unfortunately, the other things will likely already be on your horizon or appear quickly thereafter. So the bit what we see in other geographies, what we've seen in countries that might have been a bit earlier in this phase. So we would love to dig a bit deeper on these and spend a bit of extra time on the employee engagement and employee safety, because that seems to be a massive concern. How do we make sure that we can care for and engage and motivate the workforce? We'll also spend time then on the demand variability and our ability to respond appropriately, and give you a quick glance on the topic that seems currently to be less relevant, the customers and meeting their expectations. So with this, I would love to kind of introduce our kind of 3 breakouts, and we'll start with Harold on the first one, on how to engage and protect the workforce.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for that introduction. If we advance to the next slide, then the three topics that we wanted to dive a little bit further into with respect to employee safety and support are what do we see clients do in terms of encouraging a safer way of working? Initially, and response over the past week or two, we have seen a lot of people moving to working from home, social distancing, of course, but we now see a number of clients take more structural steps to create a safe working environment, as it seems that the virus will be with us for a longer period of time. The second thing that we wanted to discuss is the digital tools and capabilities that people are using to increase safety and support. We have, of course, all really rapidly learned to use Zoom and WebEx and all the other video conferencing tools, but we are now starting to see many of our clients move to that next level of digital tools and rethinking the digital process. So rather than digitizing what is fundamentally a offline process, they are now moving in the direction of rethinking the total interaction with those digital tools and the digital interaction as a starting point. And then the third topic that we wanted to discuss a little bit further was how we maintain employee connectivity and how we continue to have a community. We have, of course, all over the past few weeks sent many emails to our employees and kept them informed of what is going on. But as we now proceed into that resilience phase and start thinking about how to work over the next few months in a new way, it is also increasingly becoming clear that many clients feel that it is really important to create a community and create a virtual work environment in which people can feel connected to each other. So we wanted to share some observations of what we have seen over there. If we maybe dive into the first topic. So the first topic is what do we do with respect, or what do we see with respect to creating a safe work environment? I think what we see in the employees that are working in centers, so where people need to kind of come together in a physical space, is a little bit different than what we see in situations where we are dealing with field workers, or where people need to kind of come together. With respect to phone support, of course, the safest way of working on the phone is from the home location, but we do find that there are several situations where people still need to come into the center, and where the only real way to kind of continue to have the operation going is all be in one physical space together, and that is because of security access. I, for example, work with a client that deals with financial systems. These financial systems can only be accessed from on-site, so their employees do need to come to the site to work with these financial systems, especially since they have many clients that are obviously facing many complications given the volatility of the market recently. What they have done in order to continue to create a safe working environment with people coming into the same space is do alternate seating. So don't use every seat in the center, but keep one seat open between them. Luckily, in the rest of the building, there are some open spaces, so they have spread out their employees further. The second thing that they have started to do that I think is interesting is they have created a very different shift pattern. So instead of people all showing up at 8 o'clock or at 10 o'clock, they have people show up in 15-minute intervals. So a few employees at 8, a few more employees at 8:15, a few more employees at 8:30, and so on. And the reason for this is this minimizes the crowding in the hallways. So you have a better ability to create social distancing when people are arriving and when people are leaving for the day. The second advantage of that approach is it means that only a few people are switching workstations, and that means that you can have a cleaning crew that actually cleans every station every time before a new crew come in. Right, 10 people come in at 8, their workstations get cleaned. 10 people come at 8:15, their workstations get cleaned, etc. The third thing that that client did to maintain a safe work environment was actually asking employees to take their temperature when they enter the building, fill it into a log so that there is a record of everybody going into the building without any fevers, without any issues. For field workers, we see a little bit of a different approach. We see that people are trying to minimize the times that field workers tend to come together. Historically, a lot of field workers start from a garage in the morning, see each other over there, get their briefing, and then kind of go out for the day to do their work. We have seen several clients move to home garaging. So instead of picking up their vehicle at the central garage, they take actually the vehicle home, start their working day from home, and finish their working day from home. This, of course, leads to a complication with respect to spare parts and supplies. We have now seen several companies institute part vans. So they have a van that actually goes around at night and delivers supplies to the workers at their homes in a secure location, so that when the worker actually starts in the morning, they have the supplies already standing next to their door. They load them in their van, or they may be already in their van and kind of get going in that way. We also have seen that many of our clients have started to put practices in place for more social distancing when their field-based workers are getting to the customer site. A very effective way that we have seen is the call ahead. So in that model, instead of the employee arriving at the customer site, introducing themselves to whoever is there, which inherently creates a situation where you're close to others, they call ahead and say, I will be arriving in 10 minutes. I mean, we are practicing social distancing. We would like to keep a 6 feet distance from other employees. What is best interest for me to use? How do I get to the work site into a situation where I can keep a proper personal distance to others? The second thing that we see is working well in that environment is the digital sign-off. So rather than signing off on paper or signing off on an iPad, which in the past many more people have started to do, we have started to see that people have switched to SMS-based sign-off. So I send you an SMS, the customer signs off through that SMS and can in that way preserve a more social distance.
I see a question, Harold. How are you dealing, for example, with workers that have to be field workers that have to be at the customer side, that they are working in crews, in teams of 2-3 people, because it's necessary because of the skills, and how are you dealing with that in terms of providing the safe environment?
That is a very good question. Many of my clients have instituted fixed crews. So the risk, of course, occurs with working in crews when we start to mix people. If we have 100 employees in a particular center and every day they work with somebody else, there is a much higher risk of cross-contamination. Many of my clients that work in crews have actually started to say, we put crews together and they work like a family. They stay with each other for the next month and don't work with other crews. And that means that, the risk of cross-contamination becomes much more contained, even in the unfortunate situation when somebody might be infected, they will infect, or there is a chance they might affect the other 1 or 2 people in their crew, but they are at least isolated from the other employees that might be in your organization, and we certainly would recommend that.
And I see a couple of comments coming in that I think they're very interesting. What other clients are doing, setting up, for example, an automatic temperature sensor at the entrance. There's an alarm if someone comes in with abnormal temperature, similar to what you said. Another one, for example, is not allowing employees to take the public transportation, but to arrange a fleet of a van or bus that can pick them up, provided that remote working is not possible.
Yeah, at one of my clients, employees are indeed encouraged to use private transportation, and there's actually several organizations, including Uber, that are offering dedicated vehicles at the moment. So with a organization like Uber and Lyft, if your employees might be using that, there is actually a way to get a dedicated vehicle that only is used for your employees and is cleaned afterwards and before. And I would certainly encourage people to explore situations like that. Very good. Rodrigo, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the tools and technologies that people are starting to use currently to keep their employees safe.
So there's ways to keep people safe, distancing at work, but despite that, and Rohit shared that, there's already hundreds of millions of people that are working remotely, and that has happened abruptly. So basically, what is the technology and tools that we can think about in order to support all of this? And it's not only the technologies that are allowing teams to work together, as a team, like Zoom, maintaining video conference. We're going to cover that in a second. But it's how are we allowing those teams to serve clients, to provide the services that they are doing? And here we see several things. In service centers, there's a strong need to increase capabilities, to equip people, and to push for remote resolution as much as possible. That requires, of course, that people need to have, for example, fully configured laptops available, that they need to have connectivity. Some clients, for example, have even helped employees get connectivity at home in order to secure that they can work from home. But it's given as much as possible capabilities and tools for employees to do the work remotely and to do as much remote resolution as possible. That requires, of course, immediately that there's a need to boost up all the IT infrastructure that is supporting all of this. Scaling down on-demand support, virtual servers, high-speed internet, sometimes even clients that have been providing customers with modems in order to do remote diagnostic work, to facilitate this. And there are even things that when you're having in-field work that robotics or automation can help. Here we're not saying you should start from scratch an automation effort, because that's not going to happen given the situation. But we see, for example, a client that was cleaning services that have robots. This is a typical automated vacuum cleaner that is mopping floors in hospitals, where the demand, of course, has increased massively. So it's how can you load more of that, as soon as possible, and leverage something that you might already have ongoing. So it's two things: is I equipped my teams internally to work and to keep the team dynamics, and is how do I build those capabilities in order for those teams to be able to serve the clients. And I don't know, Senthil, if you can comment that you had a situation in India with a big number of employees now abruptly working from home. How do you deal with the logistics in order to equip them to be able to deliver?
Yeah, largely just given the pace at which India got shut down and the many centers in which you actually don't enable work from home, given confidentiality, there's sort of been a heavy triage on the customer side in understanding what is critical and needs to be delivered. And against that, a small supply group that has been enabled either through taking the desktop from in the center and enabling it at the home, or vans actually going to employees' homes with imaged laptops and delivering it to employees so that they can get enabled. The internet connection is still a solution that is not yet robust, given that is facing a strain, but access is something that people have solved in a triaged manner in a pretty rapid situation.
Excellent. And one more thing which is very important, think about your contractors as well. Because several companies have said, yeah, I'm going to secure safety and connectivity, everything of my own employees. And they forgot contractors, which sometimes are doing critical activities. And then you realize that those contractors are not able to connect or deliver in full. So those solutions need to apply to both. Let's move on to the next page. So here we have that abruptly millions of people have been put to work remotely. Even if we need to think about technology to help them be connected, be engaged. There is a lot of routines and disciplines that need to be put in place in order to enable that connectivity. So in-service centers, and something that can also be done on the field, is how do you set up a virtual social environment, for employees to be engaged, to have my check-in, midpoint check out, make sure that those routines on organizing the workload, understanding who is doing what, and checking on them is happening. That discipline is mandatory, especially when we see sometimes service centers, we are highly transactional, skill level is more basic, and these people all of a sudden have been, fragmented. How do I keep control of people and process in order to deliver? So those routines need to be put in place, leveraging Zoom, WebEx, whatever it is. It's about the routine, not only about the tool. And that is something that can also be done in the field in the same way. And then on top of that is how the other layers of management are also involved in this, not only sending emails or communication about policy changes or things around the crisis, but also being engaged on showing up virtually and checking in with every team to see how things are progressing. So again, there's a lot of discipline and new routines that have to be, that complement technology in order for this to work. In one of my clients, for example, we have installed a virtual team room, which is basically Zoom open the entire day. And people can see each other and communicate and engage. And on top of that, there is mandatory check-in, check-out, basically control the work and the delivery.
Rodrigo, thank you. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move us to our next speaker so we can make sure to get to all of our panelists.
Great. Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Martin. Hi, everyone. So we're going to move right into customer engagement. And I'm sure, as we saw in the poll, that many of you are already fully engaged in thinking about how you're interacting with your customers in different ways. And so what we'll try to do is share here a couple of examples of what we're seeing some of the other organizations do and some of the challenges that they've encountered. We break up the big four dimensions into two tranches. The first being, how are we seeing customer behaviors change? And then the second being, what operationally are organizations doing to facilitate that change? And so under the changing needs, there's really two components. The first is, how are we available and helpful to our customers remotely? And how are we reaching them in new ways digitally? We heard that in some cases the phone channels are being overwhelmed, and you may be experiencing that. And then operationally, how are we replicating the in-person experience in those situations where field operations are actually unable to come into the home or come into the business? And finally, how are organizations thinking about making trade-offs? So in many cases, service levels, both in fields and in the contact centers, are exceeding the capacity and the supply available. And so we're seeing organizations come up with volume playbooks to determine what they will support, what they won't support, and how they're augmenting the population that isn't being supported. We move on right into the first page. I'm sure this is something that you're working on, but it really cannot underscore the importance of empathy and the humanities in this moment. The fact that millions of people are trapped in their homes is not something to ignore, but actually something to acknowledge. And in many cases, we're seeing a lot more of the human connection appear when we're doing a lot of our remote sessions because individuals have an immediate connection, right? And that's actually what empathy really is, and what in the contact centers, what we're always trying to encourage agents to do is find an area of common ground. Well, in this case, it's been forced. And we find immediately on, if that's part of the dialogue, people are acknowledging in some cases the grief or the challenges that they're facing, it really does allow for patience on both sides. We're seeing in telcos do things such as release unlimited data, entertainment companies releasing movies in advance, recognizing that individuals are home, and seeing a whole number of other things that our organizations are doing to really demonstrate that empathy. The second big theme is around safety and security, and this gets materialized in a couple of ways. Initially, it starts by understanding what your customers truly care about. Right? So if you're a financial institution, it's going to be the duress and financial strain on the organization or the family. If you're in another industry, in industrials, it might be kind of supply chain of products. But really understanding what customers are the most concerned about and meeting them there. Right? So you're seeing, for example, grocery stores opening up earlier hours, opening hours between 5:30 and 7 to allow a more elderly population to shop unimpeded. You're seeing airlines waive cancellation fees and allow their customers to defer and keep the value of their flights without rebooking fees for up to a year. You're seeing banks cancel no more late fees, or not canceling home or auto insurance if in the event individuals lapse on payments through some period. All of these things are really hitting at the heart of what their customers care about, and the idea being, treat your customers well in these moments, and they'll remember these moments when we emerge from this. And then the final thing here is to the extent you can, preempt and abate as many of the calls as possible and reuse that capacity. So doing analytics to understand what are your repeat volumes, doing proactive outreach in your IBRs and your applications and your emails, building new landing pages. We have some of our telco companies are reusing a lot of their field force reps to take volume in the contact center as needed. Moving on to the next page, we talk a bit about what can be done to influence digital engagement from the start. And we heard Martin say, or Matthias say at the start, that there has been a 20% spike in volume in China. And what we are hearing from some of our clients, though, is up to 30% of that volume is from new customers that were formerly not digital savvy. And that in and of itself brings its own challenges. And so a lot of the banks and telcos that I'm working with are rethinking how they're presenting information in their app and online, really rethinking, is it truly step-by-step, written for an individual who may have never done a transaction like this before. And that's key to avoiding that need to both attempt a digital transaction, but then reach out to the contact center. And the second thing that we've learned also, though, is in terms of potential opportunities, that customers who are more digital savvy have more of a tolerance for a less than perfect digital experience than ever before. Right? So for organizations that have thought about potentially unlocking new endpoints or digital channels or digital self-service, now is the time to try those, because a customer that isn't able to reach a live rep will attempt to do something online, and you won't necessarily lose them if the experience is not yet fully flushed out. So we're seeing a lot of organizations, particularly again in the financial insurance and financial services and insurance industry, launching almost weekly new self-service options for their customers. And then finally, think about empowering a broader community than just what you've had before. That could be reusing a capacity that you have internally, but we're seeing other organizations think about other capacity that's available. So for example, in the tech space, using the gig companies, right, which is a third-party ecosystem of individuals that can help resolve issues, moving to asynchronous chat or chatbots. You're seeing small businesses use Instagram Live and Facebook Live to run sessions that they formerly weren't able to do. And you're seeing a plethora of new landing pages and FAQs appear. So really thinking about all of the tools that are available to you to reach your customer where they're going to have questions, and try not to just think of capacity being resolved within the contact center, within your remote field force. I'll turn over to my colleague, Jeff, here, who will cover the next 2 pages.
Thanks, Eric. I think 2 things as we think about taking these, the customer's behavior and operationalizing it. I think 2 things that Eric mentioned earlier, I think are forefront that how we think about this. One is just around the focus on personalization, making sure that folks are feeling intimate in their interactions, cared for in their interactions with customers or with the companies that service them. And second is this idea of patience, right? I think in today's environment, as Eric alluded, customers are increasingly patient with some of the services that they're getting because they understand a lot of their service companies' focus is on that employee welfare and health and safety that Rodrigo and Harold discussed earlier. So taking all those into consideration helps to make sure that that personalized interaction is even that much more optimized. So 3 things that we're seeing today. We talked earlier about the ability to leverage technologies as you work in with your employees. Obviously, the same is true as you work with your customers. They are all getting more used to Zoom and to WebEx, etc. But you can also consider technologies that help with some of that actual customer-facing interactions and moving it more digitally, like the Visolutions of the world, where you do screen sharing and you're able to walk customers through mortgage documents or telephone contracts, etc., and do it live there, interacting with them online. Second here is when we organize our employees in terms of teams to make sure that while customers contact us, their issues are resolved the first time. And so you see, I'm sure a lot of you have heard and read the HBR article with T-Mobile on their team of experts, right? So they've got a cross-functional group of folks that were from the field, folks in the back office to handle whatever inquiry comes their way, and they do it in a live manner, which is great. You also see a lot of field techs that may have been out in the field are now finding themselves into the call center and serving as that escalation point for highly technical issues. And then finally here, this idea of sending personal follow-ups. I think restaurants and retailers have always been pretty good at this, of thanking customers for coming into their establishments. I think in today's day and age, that's even that much more important for more of the day-to-day business interactions. Again, all with this idea of personalization. So I just challenge you all to think through how are you increasing that that personalization and that proactive follow-up. Go to the next slide. This idea of trade-offs, again, as you think about operationalizing it, is becoming forefront to a lot of companies. We're seeing huge spikes in call volume for certain industries, and being able to deal with that in a methodical manner is key in today's day and age. So Eric alluded to this idea of spike playbooks. You know, there's ideas of how do you, as you get to certain levels for certain types of calls, and banks are really good at this, especially now. How can you start to deflect some of those calls maybe into other, maybe to the branch, if their branches are still open for a certain period of time, rather than having some of these critical folks wait on hold. This idea of incentives. We talked about it earlier with travel, being able to take away fees for changing airline reservations or travel abroad. The one other thing that we're seeing is how are you incentivizing folks so that you prevent a call. So for instance, in the hotel space, I just got an email from one of my hoteliers that says, hey, your status is now extended until 2022. So, you know, they're mitigating a whole lot of calls that would have otherwise come in asking about my status. Hey, I'm less traveling. What's the implications of this? So you kind of put the customer at ease a bit by offering these longer term incentives. And then finally, hinging on this idea of patience, just providing open and transparent communications to your customers on what things you may be suspending or stopping and why. So we've all gotten the emails about airline travel and, hey, if you don't have a reservation within 72 hours, please call back. You get some manufacturers or field delivery folks who may have pivoted their focus from their core product to helping advance medical product manufacturing and or delivery. And so being transparent on that, I think, goes and tugs at the heartstrings of the customers, while at the same time being transparent that you may not get the service levels that you would expect because of the dynamic situation. So these are the.
We had a question come in to the Q&A panel about if you had any examples you could share of the types of transaction organizations are deflecting. And before you answer that, I just want to encourage people to go ahead and use that Q&A panel if you have any questions. But any examples you could give, Jeff?
Sure. Well, I think password resets, account management, et cetera. Those are the traditional ones that you would expect to deflect as much as possible this transactional volume that you try to deflect to digital channels or self-service channels. I think just over the course of the last couple of weeks, I think another big one is the status of orders or the status of deliveries. Again, with the idea that companies, whether you're in the food delivery business or the grocery business or the healthcare business, where you have to deliver goods to folks that are homebound, working to get those inquiries on terms of the status onto digital channels helps to relieve a lot of the call volume. Is an example I'm seeing a lot of focus on for companies in getting those transactions onto digital channels.
Thanks. I think in the interest of time, we'll go to the next slide.
Yes. So we wanted to also talk about a little bit the impact and the very significant impact we see both on the supply and the demand side of sort of service operations, anything from customer service to middle back office services. And the very sort of short-term situation that we've seen with many of our clients, and I think this has been something that many of us have been working 24/7 on for the last couple of weeks, is a significant impact on sort of outsourced and global delivery centers. With the India lockdown, we see organizations losing a lot of their capacity, a lot of their supply capacity. We also want to talk a little bit about how you can work with sort of the customer side and drive prioritization and how important that is to make sure that you actually service the most important customers. And then we also wanted to talk about how, or where you have supply that is not fully used in this situation, what are those things that you can use as an opportunity? And this might be slightly more of a midterm action. So let's go to the next page. Thank you. So what we see on sort of outsourced offshore shared service center situation right now is most of them had, of course, business continuity plans, but they were mainly aligned so that if there was a flooding in Chennai in India, you would switch to Manila. Right? There wasn't really the business continuity plan that looked at what if the whole world needs to work from home. So the impact has been quite fundamental. And we see that sort of captive internal shared service center commonly has plans for anywhere between 60 to 90% remote working capability, while actually outsourced capacity is much lower in work from home, mainly due to contract restrictions that exist. So customers have been very good at making sure that provider works in secure environments, while now that means that the providers have not prepared for a work from home situation in the same extent. So we see clients, and I was just speaking with a large global telco here yesterday, and they were able to get 60 to 70% of their capacity in India to work from home, While we also see on top of that, that in shared service center environments, when people work from home, you lose an additional 30 to 40% of productivity. So those two things in combination means that suddenly you're sitting with less than half of your capacity. And for call centers, for back office, IT, finance, HR, shared services, that is a very, very challenging situation. And when I was speaking to this leader at the telco company, he had just been on the phone because the one existing center they had in Calcutta had just been raided by the police, claiming that they were not keeping social distancing rules. So this is a very fast-moving situation. There are a couple of things that we recommend. They are about making sure that you get as much capacity as possible working from home. And these are very tactical things like canceling vacations, making sure that we have heard example of actually driving around and sort of putting out laptops and dual screens, etc. So you will make sure that as many as possible of your staff actually can work from home. The second thing is that make sure that those people work on the most important things, right? You want to keep the pipe as wide and you want to make sure that you use it for the best. These could be things like don't do trainings, maybe stop some of the reporting that will be important otherwise. Maybe today we don't need to do an SLA or end of a week report. Those can actually wait. So both those things in combination, we've seen supporting at least of driving up the capacity. And that can be then combined with things like we heard, maybe bringing in additional continued workers, maybe other people that can actually support you and be quickly trained. And the final initiative that we've seen is actually very quickly try to put in technology. So have more of a digital workforce that can actually support you in delivery. So this is a fast-moving area, probably one we will get back to quickly and share more of our observations as this evolve. I want to hand over to Guy now to cover a little bit about the customer situation.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to touch this briefly, but we're always thinking about how we can prioritize demand for services. And as you probably see now, demand is changing, right? So there's either very, very lower demand, or there's some areas where we're actually seeing increased demand. So for example, in all the medical industry. And one of the few things that we're seeing that is done is how to triage service calls and customer demand into different tiers. So basically think about your customers. Who are the customers that we have to touch, we have to service no matter what now? Who are the services, who are the customers who are actually we don't have access to, so we can't really touch them now physically? And who are maybe the customers that we may have touched recently, so we can kind of postpone when we're going to touch them next, and kind of thinking what are the tiers that we can allocate them to, and based on that, use our capacity and go touch the services. And we're seeing companies do that today. Another thing that we're seeing is how to delay demand, right? So how to think about how to avoid being on site with your text where is needed, right? Can you use different either technology or processes to avoid being on site? One of the things that we're seeing is a company that actually now is doing virtual sessions. So they're calling in using, again, either Zoom or Skype, and having the customer do the actual maintenance, but with using their own kind of virtual assistants. And there's different technologies that you can use that actually help with that, different AR technology and different processes that you can use. But we're actually seeing that happen where you can call in, have kind of guide the customer as they do it. And here you have to be very careful in making sure they understand, the customer understand that this is not in place of an actual maintenance. This is just as kind of helping them to either do something, fixing something for now, or kind of making sure that the equipment will keep running as long as, until we can actually come and touch the equipment, right? And then the last one is also we're seeing kind of service organization, basically talking to engineering department and seeing, okay, what is the bare minimum that I need to do to make sure that the equipment keeps running, right? To make sure that I'm not really doing anything to damage the asset. We're seeing companies kind of moving from a 12-month cycle to 18-month cycle of maintenance. We're seeing companies saying, okay, if this is the bare minimum that I need to do, so next time I have a break fix, I'm going to make sure I'm also doing this very simple preventive maintenance work because I don't know when's the next time I'm going to be able to touch the asset. Right? So that's kind of like things to think about when you're dealing with different demand and thinking about how am I going to prioritize my customers. Next page, please. This is more on how to, what do you think about with demand in contactless world, right? Like, so how do we kind of assess the emerging demand patterns and try to predict, okay, these are the resources that I have, but this is the demand that I'm seeing and predicting, and how am I going to shift my resources? How am I going to make sure that my field force can touch not only this type of equipment, but also other types of equipment where I'm seeing the influx in demand, so you don't have too much idle time in your field force, right? We're also seeing how to kind of implement different channels, right? So remote resolution, we're seeing telecom providers that are now having more remote resolution in place, even though if before, kind of because of different processes, they would say, okay, this is only something that I can do on site. Now they're moving to a more remote resolution and more self-serve, as we kind of talked about before, because you want to minimize that physical contact, either because your customers don't want you to be on site, and we're hearing that as well, or you cannot send your text there physically. And then the last thing, which I think is really important, is also thinking about, okay, now you have stranded capacity, but in a few weeks or a few months, you're going to get a huge spike in demand. How are you going to get ready for this? How are you going to use this time now that you have that available capacity to make sure that you're ready? So you can do cross-training. You can think about how to work on increasing productivity initiatives that you have going on and you want to start, and basically be ready to kind of take that spike in capacity that's going to come towards you.